It was a cold, crisp evening in Chicago. The skyline of the city gleamed under the twilight, reflecting the many lives that lived within its bustling streets. Among these lives was a young banker named Thomas Walker. At 32, Thomas had worked his way up in a prominent financial firm, his sharp mind and hard work making him a rising star. But despite his success in the world of numbers and ledgers, Thomas found himself haunted by one thing: his relationship with a woman named Lisa. Lisa Thompson, 28, had been the love of Thomas's life. They met during a company event where Lisa, a beautiful and ambitious marketing professional, had caught his eye. Over time, their relationship blossomed into something serious, with dreams of a future together. They often spoke about their hopes, their plans, and the life they would build. But Thomas was blind to the cracks forming beneath the surface of their relationship. Lisa had begun to grow distant. Thomas, consumed by his work, didn't notice at first. But eventually Lisa told him something that shattered his world. She was leaving him. The reason was clear. She had fallen for someone else, and that someone was none other than Thomas's boss, the powerful and influential Robert Matthews. Robert Matthews was a man in his late 40s, a well-respected executive with a reputation for being ruthless in business. He had been the one to offer Thomas his big break, bringing him into the firm and promoting him to higher positions. But with his success came the pressure of always needing to prove himself. When Thomas was informed of his termination from the firm, a decision made by Robert himself, it stung. Yet the news of Lisa's betrayal hurt even more. How could she leave me for him? Thomas thought bitterly. The woman he had trusted had chosen a man who had just fired him. The betrayal cut deep, and he began to sink into a dark hole of anger and despair. Lisa tried to explain, but Thomas didn't want to listen. He couldn't. The thought of her with Robert was more than he could bear. In the days that followed, Thomas became consumed by rage. He couldn't let go of the idea that he had been humiliated, both by his girlfriend's infidelity and his firing from the company. The idea of revenge began to grow within him, gnawing at his mind. Lisa had moved in with Robert, starting a new life. She seemed happy, but to Thomas, it felt like she had taken everything from him: his job, his future, and most painfully, her love. His mind raced, cycling between thoughts of sorrow, anger, and a desire for retribution. One night, as he sat in his dimly lit apartment, alone and brooding, he finally made a decision. He couldn't stand the thought of Lisa being with Robert, of the man who had taken both his job and his girlfriend, winning her over. Thomas knew he had to act. The next few days passed in a blur for Thomas. He couldn't focus on anything except for his growing obsession with Lisa and Robert. Every time he saw them together, every time he thought about the way she had walked out on him, his mind burned with a desire for payback. The city of Chicago seemed to have an eerie silence surrounding him as he walked its streets. There was a gnawing feeling in his chest, the kind that tells you you're standing at the edge of something terrible, yet irresistible. He was no longer the composed banker people saw in the office. He was a man on the verge of snapping. Lisa had once been his everything. Her laughter, her touch, her smile. All of it was now a painful memory, and now she had moved on, living her life with Robert. The idea of them together, laughing, sharing intimate moments, infuriated him. Robert had taken everything, and Lisa had willingly handed it to him. In his quiet apartment, Thomas began to plan. He was no longer just a jilted lover. He was a man who believed revenge was the only way to right the wrongs done to him. His mind raced, calculating every step, every detail. He knew he couldn't just walk into their lives and demand they pay for their betrayal. No, that would be too obvious. His plan needed to be flawless, undetectable, and most importantly, it needed to leave them both broken. He thought back to the moments he and Lisa had shared, the times they'd gone out to fancy restaurants, the walks in the park, the late-night talks. He knew her routines, the places she liked to go, the times when she would be vulnerable. She was predictable, and in his mind, that was a dangerous thing. He was always a step behind her in their relationship, but now he would be several steps ahead. Thomas waited for the right moment. It came sooner than he expected. One evening, he learned that Lisa and Robert were planning a quiet weekend getaway. Robert had told her they were going to spend time away from the city, focusing on their relationship. Thomas smiled to himself, knowing this was his chance. He waited until the day they were supposed to leave. As soon as Lisa's car pulled out of the driveway, he put his plan into motion. Thomas had spent the past few days preparing. He had watched Robert's schedule, and he knew when he would be out of the office or busy with work meetings. He had also taken the time to track Lisa's movements, learning the precise time she would be meeting Robert at a secluded cabin in the woods, far from the city. This trip was supposed to be their escape from the chaos, but it would become their nightmare. On the evening before their departure, Thomas slipped into the back office of the bank. He had spent years there, so he knew the ins and outs of the building, and the security systems had become second nature to him. The building was deserted at this hour, and he knew he had time to work undisturbed. He carefully disabled the security cameras around the area where Robert's private files were kept. No one would know what he was about to do. The next morning, Thomas sent a text message to Lisa pretending to be Robert. He knew it would be the perfect bait to get her alone. The message was simple, directing her to meet Robert at the cabin earlier than expected. Lisa, not suspecting anything, agreed, believing it was her boyfriend telling her to come. But Thomas had other plans. At the same time, he had set up an elaborate alibi for himself. He was going to be seen by his neighbors, taking a walk around the neighborhood, appearing completely innocent. But in truth, he had another destination. Thomas drove to the cabin just before Lisa arrived. The cold wind rustled the trees around him, the silence only broken by the crunch of his boots on the ground. It was remote, isolated, the perfect place for what he was about to do. He had no intention of leaving anything to chance. When Lisa arrived, Thomas was waiting. She looked confused at first, but as soon as she stepped out of her car and saw him standing there, everything became clear. The shock in her eyes was almost too much for him to bear, but he forced himself to keep calm. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You thought you could just walk away from me." Thomas's voice was cold, emotionless. "I gave you everything, and you threw it away for him. Now it's time for you to pay." Lisa tried to back away, but it was too late. The rage that had built up inside him for weeks now erupted in a single, violent act. He didn't want to do it, but in his mind it was the only way. Revenge, he believed, would finally set him free. As Lisa fell, the life draining out of her, Thomas stood over her, breathing heavily. He had done it. The woman who had betrayed him and the man who had destroyed his career would never hurt him again. But even as he stood there, something deep inside him told him that this would not be the end. The consequences of his actions would soon come to light, and it would be up to someone else to uncover the truth. But for now, all Thomas could feel was the rush of triumph. It wasn't long before the news of Lisa's death spread throughout the city. The police received an anonymous call the next morning, alerting them to a body found at a secluded cabin just outside of Chicago. A woman had been murdered, and it didn't take long for the authorities to realize that Lisa Thompson was the victim. Detective Claire Morgan had been on the force for nearly 15 years, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving even the most complex cases. She was known for her sharp instincts and relentless pursuit of justice. When the call came in, Claire knew this case would be like no other. The cold, brutal nature of the crime was troubling, and the fact that Lisa had been found alone in such an isolated location made the case even more puzzling. Claire arrived at the crime scene early that morning. The cold air bit at her skin as she stepped out of the car and surveyed the area. The cabin was nestled in a forested area, far from the nearest town. The trees loomed overhead, their branches bare from the winter chill, creating a haunting backdrop. The police had already cordoned off the area, and forensic teams were beginning their work. Claire approached the body with a grim expression. Lisa Thompson was lying face down in the snow, a pool of blood surrounding her. It was clear that she had been murdered, and from the way her body was positioned, Claire could tell this was no random attack. This was personal. "Any signs of forced entry?" Claire asked one of the officers. "No, detective," the officer replied. "The door was unlocked, and nothing seems to have been disturbed inside. It's like she came here willingly. Claire nodded. This was a critical detail. The fact that Lisa had entered the cabin willingly suggested that she knew her attacker, or at least trusted them. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, trying to piece together the events that led to this moment. Has anyone spoken to her family or friends? She asked, her mind already working through the possibilities. We spoke with her roommate, the officer said. She told us Lisa was supposed to meet her boyfriend here, Robert Matthews. She mentioned something about a weekend getaway, but the roommate didn't know when exactly. Claire's eyes narrowed. Robert Matthews. The name rang a bell. He was a prominent executive at one of the city's top financial firms. Claire knew him by reputation. She also knew that a wealthy, well-connected man like him would likely be under scrutiny now. Get me the contact information for Robert Matthews, Claire ordered. I want to speak with him immediately. Claire turned to the forensics team, who were beginning their preliminary examination of the body. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. The clock was ticking, and she had a feeling this case would only get more complicated as it unfolded. Back at the police station, Claire began to dig into Lisa's background. She discovered that Lisa had been dating a man named Thomas Walker, a banker at a local financial firm. The relationship had ended recently, and from what Claire could gather, it had been a messy breakup. Lisa had reportedly left Thomas for Robert Matthews, which added another layer of complexity to the case. Was this a love triangle gone wrong? Or was there something deeper at play? Claire requested to speak with Lisa's colleagues and friends to learn more about her relationships and possible motives. She needed to understand Lisa's interactions with both Thomas and Robert, and what kind of person Lisa had been. The more Claire knew, the better her chances of solving the case. Within hours, Claire was sitting in her office, going over the information she had gathered. Lisa was well liked by her colleagues, and there had been no signs of any serious conflict with anyone at work. However, her romantic life was a different story. Her relationship with Thomas had been intense, but it appeared that Lisa had fallen for Robert after the breakup. There was no clear indication that anyone else would have had a motive to harm her, at least not yet. Claire took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair. Everything pointed to Thomas as a potential suspect. His history with Lisa, the violent nature of the crime, and the personal connection between him and Robert Matthews all pointed to one conclusion. Thomas had a motive, but Claire knew better than to jump to conclusions. She needed hard evidence, not just speculation. Get me an address for Thomas Walker, Claire said to her partner, Detective Mark Davis. I want to talk to him next. Mark nodded and left the room. As Claire sat there, her mind raced. She had a gut feeling that Thomas was involved, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. The case was far from straightforward, and every piece of the puzzle seemed to be leading her in different directions. The clock was ticking, and Claire knew she had to find the truth before more lives were destroyed. She was determined to bring Lisa's killer to justice, no matter how complicated the case became. Detective Claire Morgan sat in her car outside a modest apartment building on the south side of Chicago. The chilly wind outside sent a shiver down her spine. But it wasn't the weather that had her on edge. It was the case, and the man she was about to confront. Thomas Walker was a banker, an unassuming man in his early 30s. From everything Claire had gathered, he had been deeply hurt by Lisa's decision to leave him for Robert Matthews. That hurt had turned into something darker: resentment, anger, and now, possibly murder. She had already spoken to his neighbors, who described him as quiet, reserved, someone who kept to himself. They hadn't heard anything unusual the night of Lisa's death, and none of them seemed to think he was capable of something violent. But appearances could be deceiving. Claire approached the front door of Thomas's apartment and rang the bell. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing a man with tired eyes and a nervous expression. Thomas Walker was dressed casually, his hair slightly disheveled, but there was a certain air of discomfort about him as he stood in the doorway. "Yes?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Thomas Walker?" Claire asked, flashing her badge. Thomas hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes. How can I help you?" "I'm Detective Claire Morgan. I'm investigating the murder of Lisa Thompson. Can I speak with you for a moment?" Claire asked, her voice calm but firm. Thomas's face went pale. He swallowed hard before stepping aside to let her in. "Of course, I I don't know what I can tell you. This is all so surreal. Claire followed him inside, noting the sparse, almost sterile nature of the apartment. It looked like a place where someone who spent most of their time working would live. The furniture was minimal, and the walls were bare, save for a few scattered photographs. Have a seat, Thomas offered, motioning to the couch. I'll get you something to drink. Coffee? No, thank you, Claire replied, sitting down. Let's get to the point. I need to ask you a few questions about Lisa Thompson. Thomas froze for a moment, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. What's this about? Is she okay? Claire looked him in the eye. I'm afraid Lisa is dead, Thomas. She was murdered. His face twisted in shock. No, no, that's impossible. She was supposed to be with Robert this weekend. They went away. I don't understand. Where were you the night Lisa died? Claire asked, her tone blunt. What were you doing? Thomas shifted uncomfortably, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. I was home. Just alone. Alone? Claire asked, her voice sharp. You weren't with anyone? No alibi? Thomas shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't with anyone. I was just thinking. I don't know what else to say. Claire studied his face, looking for any sign of guilt. He was sweating, his eyes darting around the room nervously. This wasn't the reaction of someone who had just heard terrible news about an ex-girlfriend. This was the reaction of someone trying to keep a secret, someone who was hiding something. I know about your relationship with Lisa, Thomas, Claire continued, her eyes never leaving his. And I know that she left you for Robert Matthews. That must have hurt. But you don't seem to have any solid alibi for the night of her death. Can you explain why that is? Thomas's breathing quickened. I didn't kill Lisa. I loved her. I would never… Claire interrupted him. I'm not accusing you of anything yet, Thomas. But you need to understand that we're going to find out everything. If you have any information, now's the time to tell me. Thomas seemed to shrink under her gaze. He sank into a chair across from Claire, his eyes downcast. I didn't kill her. I swear. I was angry when she left me for Robert. I won't deny that, but I never wanted her dead. I just wanted her back. I thought if I gave her time, she would come back to me. I didn't want to hurt her. Claire leaned forward, watching him closely. Did you know where she was going that weekend? Thomas's gaze flickered, and he bit his lip. She said she was going to be with Robert. She had told me before that they were going to spend some time together. I didn't know exactly where, but I thought it was some cabin or something out in the woods. I didn't know she was dead. I had nothing to do with this. Claire sat back, considering his words. There was something about his story that felt off. If he had been so heartbroken, why hadn't he tried to reach out to Lisa one last time? Why hadn't he tried to reconcile or at least make amends before this? He seemed too calm, too defensive for someone who truly cared for her. Claire decided it was time to push further. What were you doing when Lisa died, Thomas? She asked, her tone now more insistent. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I was at home. I don't know how else to explain it. I wasn't even thinking about her that night. I didn't know anything had happened until you showed up here today. Claire stood up, her mind already racing through the possibilities. We'll be in touch, Thomas. Don't leave town. As she left the apartment, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was hiding something. His lack of emotion, his refusal to provide a solid alibi. It all pointed to one thing. He was hiding the truth. But Claire couldn't quite figure out what part he played in all this. She needed more evidence, more information. Back at the precinct, Claire sat at her desk, reviewing the evidence she had so far. She had a hunch that Thomas knew more than he was letting on, and soon she would uncover the truth. Detective Claire Morgan sat in her office, the evidence scattered before her. She had just left Thomas Walker's apartment, and something about his story didn't sit right. His defensiveness, his inability to provide a solid alibi, and his strange reaction to the news of Lisa's death were troubling. But she had no concrete evidence to tie him to the murder. Yet, Claire had learned one crucial piece of information in her investigation. The weekend that Lisa had been murdered, she had been in a secluded cabin, supposedly with Robert Matthews. The idea that Lisa had gone to meet her new boyfriend wasn't surprising. What was surprising, however, was the lack of any details about where this cabin was. Claire needed to know more about Robert Matthews and whether he was involved, or if there was someone else pulling the strings. Claire placed a call to Robert's office. The receptionist answered quickly, and Claire was able to schedule an appointment for the following morning. Robert Matthews was a man of status, someone with connections, and Claire knew that dealing with someone like him would be a different challenge altogether. She had no illusions about the difficulties of interviewing a man of his stature, but she was determined to dig deeper into Lisa's relationship with him. The next morning, Claire arrived at the corporate offices of Robert Matthews. The building was sleek and modern, filled with glass walls that allowed the sunlight to flood into the lobby. It was a world far removed from the gritty streets of Chicago where Claire was most comfortable. The receptionist at the front desk gave her an inquisitive look, clearly wondering what a detective was doing in such a high-end space. "Detective Morgan to see Mr. Matthews," she said, trying to sound professional despite her growing unease. Moments later, a young assistant escorted her through the elevator to Robert Matthews' office on the top floor. It was a stark contrast to Thomas Walker's apartment. Robert's office was immaculate, a symbol of success, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. The air felt heavy, as if the office itself had absorbed the power and influence Robert Matthews had cultivated over the years. "Detective Morgan," Robert greeted her, standing up from his desk with a tight smile. His handshake was firm, but there was something cold about him. He was tall, well-dressed in an expensive suit, with perfectly styled hair. It was clear he had spent years building his career. But Claire wasn't here to discuss his career. She was here to find out what he knew about Lisa's death. "Mr. Matthews," Claire replied, taking a seat across from his desk. "I'm investigating the murder of Lisa Thompson. I have a few questions for you about your relationship with her." Robert's expression faltered for a moment, then he recovered, his face falling into a more neutral mask. "Lisa? My God, I can't believe she's gone. We were supposed to spend the weekend together." His voice was filled with genuine sorrow, but Claire wasn't convinced. There was something about his demeanor that made her cautious. "Can you tell me about your relationship with Lisa?" Claire asked, watching his every move. "When did you last speak to her?" Robert leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "We were close," he said carefully, his voice smooth. "We had been seeing each other for a few months after she left Thomas. I think she was happy with me. We had plans. She had some personal things she wanted to sort out, but we were very much in love." Claire took a mental note of his words. Robert Matthews was trying hard to portray himself as a grieving man, but Claire wasn't buying it. There was a calculated quality to his tone. He was a man used to controlling situations. "When did you last speak with Lisa?" Claire asked again, narrowing her eyes. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The night before she left, we spoke on the phone. She told me she was heading to the cabin we rented in the woods just for the weekend. She said she wanted some time alone before we really committed to being together. It was a bit odd, but I understood. I thought everything was fine." "And where is this cabin?" Claire pressed. "Can you give me the address?" Robert hesitated, his eyes darting to the side as if considering how to respond. I'm not sure of the exact location. It was a private getaway, not something I'd normally disclose to anyone. Lisa handled the booking, and she preferred to keep the details private." His smile was tight, as though he was trying to distance himself from any suspicion. Claire studied him for a moment, sensing that there was more he wasn't saying. "What do you know about her relationship with Thomas Walker?" she asked, her voice low but pointed. Robert's expression changed slightly, his eyes flashing with something like anger, before he quickly masked it with indifference. "I know she was with him before me. They had a complicated relationship. I don't know the details, and frankly, I don't care. What matters is that we were happy together." Claire felt a slight pang of suspicion. Robert's reaction was too quick, too defensive. He clearly didn't want to discuss Thomas, but there had to be more to the story. Claire knew that sometimes the most revealing information came from what people tried to avoid talking about. "Do you know if Lisa had any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt her?" Claire asked, hoping to get more information out of him. Robert's face remained unchanged, though his hands clenched into fists on the desk. Number Lisa was well liked. She had a few disagreements here and there, but nothing serious. Claire stood up, noting the shift in his demeanor. I'm going to need more information, Mr. Matthews. If you remember anything else, anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me. As she turned to leave, Robert's voice stopped her. Detective, if you suspect me, you're wasting your time. I loved Lisa. You have to believe me. Claire didn't respond. She simply left the office, her mind swirling with questions. Robert Matthews had been careful, but there were cracks in his story. He was hiding something, and it was up to Claire to figure out what. Back at the precinct, Claire met with her partner, Mark Davis. I don't think Robert's telling the truth. He's hiding something about that cabin and about his relationship with Lisa. We need to find out more about his connection to Thomas, too. Mark nodded, his expression grim. I think you're right. Something's off with both of them. Let's dig deeper. Claire's instincts were telling her the case was far from over, but she was getting closer. Closer to uncovering the truth that would tie everything together, and she was determined to bring justice to Lisa, no matter what. Detective Claire Morgan sat at her desk, reviewing the latest developments in the case. She'd spent hours combing through evidence and interviewing witnesses, but the pieces still didn't fit together. Thomas Walker's shaky alibi, Robert Matthews' vague statements, and the mysterious cabin, nothing added up. The more Claire investigated, the more she began to suspect that the truth was more tangled than she had anticipated. The most frustrating part was that there were no obvious leads. Lisa had been murdered with a single precise blow to the head, no struggle, no sign of forced entry into the cabin. It was as though her killer had been waiting for her, someone who knew her, someone close. Claire decided to re-examine the financial side of things. Thomas was a banker after all, and Lisa had worked at a high-end boutique. Money had always been a subtle but underlying factor in many crimes. Claire needed to dig deeper into their financial situations, and more specifically, into the financial ties between Thomas, Robert, and Lisa. She began by reaching out to Lisa's bank. The branch manager was hesitant to speak at first, but after some convincing, she agreed to help. Claire sat down with the manager, a woman in her mid-40s, who explained that Lisa had several accounts with the bank, most of which were relatively standard for someone in her position. But there was one detail that stood out to Claire: the last large transfer made from Lisa's account. The transaction had occurred just days before her death, and it involved a substantial sum of money, $50,000. Did she make this transfer herself? Claire asked, her mind racing. The bank manager nodded. Yes, it was an online transaction. The recipient's name was Robert Matthews. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Robert Matthews, the same man who claimed to have been in love with Lisa, the same man who had made it clear he wanted to avoid discussing anything about her previous relationship with Thomas. And now there was financial evidence linking him directly to her, just days before her murder. It was too much of a coincidence. I need to see the transaction history for Robert Matthews, Claire said firmly. The manager hesitated but eventually agreed. Within minutes, Claire had the paperwork she needed, and her suspicions deepened as she examined the documents. Robert Matthews had been making substantial withdrawals from his own accounts, just weeks before Lisa's death. The transactions were frequent, and the amounts were high, sometimes up to $25,000 at a time. But one thing stood out to Claire. These withdrawals had coincided with Lisa's large deposit. It wasn't just a simple exchange of money. It looked like Robert Matthews had been taking more than his fair share from someone else, someone he could manipulate. Detective Morgan, I just thought of something, the bank manager said, interrupting Claire's thoughts. There was a loan application from Robert Matthews that came through around the same time as those withdrawals. I don't know if it's related, but I thought it might be worth mentioning. A loan application. Claire's mind clicked into overdrive. If Robert had been trying to secure money through questionable means, it would explain his strained finances and possible motives for targeting Lisa. He had no choice but to keep up appearances, and a substantial loan could have been his way of covering up his mounting debts. With new urgency, Claire returned to the precinct, where she immediately began working with financial experts to cross-check Matthew's finances. But she knew she needed to dig into Thomas's financials as well. She couldn't ignore the possibility that Thomas had something to do with Lisa's death, particularly if Robert had been manipulating Lisa in more ways than one. She reached out to the bank manager at Thomas Walker's branch and asked for the details of his accounts. After a brief exchange, Claire learned that Thomas had received a substantial sum of money just before the breakup. A deposit for over $100,000 had been made into his account, but the origin of the funds remained unclear. It was a curious amount, one that could be tied to something far larger than what appeared on the surface. It didn't take long for Claire to put the pieces together. Thomas had been sacked from his position at the bank, which would have been humiliating, particularly given the stature of his former employer, Robert Matthews. But then something changed. Robert Matthews had essentially taken Thomas's career away from him, exchanging his position for a romantic relationship with Lisa. There had to be a motive somewhere. Claire sat back, rereading the notes she had on Thomas and Robert. Her gut told her that both of them had something to hide. Robert was hiding his financial struggles, and Thomas was hiding his humiliation. But it wasn't just the money that kept Claire up at night. It was the psychological aspect of the crime. The timing was too perfect. Lisa had left Thomas, and in a calculated attempt at revenge, he would have known that Robert would be the perfect target. By now, Claire had built a clearer picture. Thomas had no alibi, and he had a strong motive for revenge. But Robert Matthews was no less guilty. The two men were like pieces of a puzzle, and only by fitting them together would she find the true picture of Lisa's murder. Claire knew that she couldn't just charge them based on their financial ties alone. She needed more evidence, more connections. But now she had a way forward. Robert Matthews and Thomas Walker had been weaving a tangled web of lies, money, and betrayal, and it was up to her to untangle it. As the day came to a close, Claire made a call to Mark Davis, her partner. "I need you to look into something. Robert Matthews and Thomas Walker's connections go beyond what we've seen so far. We're missing something, and I need you to find it." Mark's voice crackled through the phone. "Got it, Claire. I'll start digging." Claire exhaled, feeling the weight of the case settling into her chest. The walls were closing in on both men, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. Detective Claire Morgan sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, staring at the two suspects in front of her. Thomas Walker, the disgraced banker, and Robert Matthews, the powerful executive, both men had finally been brought in for questioning. The moment of truth had arrived. For weeks, Claire had meticulously pieced together the evidence, the financial transactions, the testimonies, and the damning connections between the two men. Now she had to see if her theories held up under the pressure of their confrontation. Thomas sat nervously, his hands twitching in his lap, while Robert remained composed, as if he had nothing to fear. Claire knew that both men had been living a lie, but now they couldn't escape the truth any longer. "Let's cut to the chase," Claire began, her voice steady. "Lisa Dawson is dead. We know she was killed because of a twisted love triangle involving both of you. But who's going to crack first?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Robert, who still kept his cold demeanor. "Thomas," Claire continued, "we know you had a motive. You were fired, humiliated, and replaced by Robert here, not just in your job, but in Lisa's heart. You watched as Robert took everything you had, your career, your dignity, and most painfully, your girlfriend. That must have eaten at you, didn't it?" Thomas flinched, his eyes darting away from hers. The quiet tension in the room was palpable. He opened his mouth but said nothing, clearly caught between fear and guilt. Claire turned her gaze toward Robert. "And you, Robert, you saw Lisa as nothing more than another possession? You took her from Thomas, and we now know you were hiding financial difficulties. You were desperate for money, but instead of being honest about your situation, you manipulated Lisa. You knew she had the resources you needed." Robert's lips curled into a tight smile, his eyes narrow. "I don't know what you're talking about." Claire didn't flinch. She had the truth in her hands, and she wasn't letting go now. The $50,000 transaction from Lisa's account to yours wasn't a gift, Robert. You used her to cover your debts. And when Lisa started pulling away from you, when she realized the truth about your financial instability, You knew you couldn't let her go. She was your lifeline. Robert's expression faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. But Claire knew she had him. He was already slipping. Thomas, Claire said, turning back to the banker. You knew Lisa was leaving you for Robert. You had already lost her and everything you had worked for, but you couldn't accept it. And when you found out about Robert's financial ties to Lisa, the plan started to form. You decided that if you couldn't have her, neither could Robert. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. I just... She was everything to me. Claire leaned forward, locking eyes with him. You went to that cabin, Thomas. You waited for her. You killed her out of jealousy and spite. The blow to her head was quick, precise. Your anger was so deep, you didn't even let her see it coming. Thomas trembled, the guilt overwhelming him. He clenched his fists, fighting back the tears. I couldn't stand seeing her with him. After everything we went through together, she was mine. Robert's calm facade finally cracked as he turned to Thomas, his voice low but intense. You fool, he muttered. You couldn't have her, so you destroyed her. I was going to fix things. I was going to pay off my debts, get everything back on track. But you ruined it all. The words hung in the air as Robert's anger seeped through. Claire's intuition was spot on. Robert Matthews had been as much of a criminal as Thomas, but in a different way. Robert hadn't killed Lisa with his hands, but he had killed her spirit long before she ever left Thomas. He had manipulated her for his own gain, and when she realized the truth, she began to distance herself. That was when Robert saw his opportunity. He needed to protect his financial interests, and if that meant silencing Lisa, so be it. Claire's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the tension. It was Mark Davis, her partner, sending over the final piece of evidence, a video from the cabin's security camera, confirming what Claire had already suspected. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough. It showed Thomas Walker arriving at the cabin, waiting for Lisa. It showed him striking her with a blunt object, a heavy metal piece that had been left near the cabin's fireplace. The video didn't show Robert's involvement, but it confirmed Thomas's presence at the scene. Claire stood up and placed the phone on the table. This is over, gentlemen. You both played a part in Lisa's death. Thomas, you killed her in a fit of rage, and Robert, you manipulated her. Both of you are responsible for her death. Thomas broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. He buried his face in his hands, realizing the full extent of his actions. Robert, on the other hand, remained silent, his pride shattered, but his defiance intact. You're both going to pay for this, Claire said firmly. The law doesn't care about your money, your pride, or your twisted games. All it cares about is justice. As the officers moved in to place them under arrest, Claire took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the case lift off her shoulders. It had been a long, painful journey, but the truth had finally been revealed. Lisa Dawson had been the victim of betrayal, jealousy, and greed. Her life taken by the very people who should have cared for her most. Claire walked out of the room, her heart heavy with the knowledge that justice had been served. But in the end, justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about ensuring that the truth was never forgotten. And that was exactly what she had done.